Have you ever felt like your entire life was built on a lie? I was 17 when I found out the truth, that my sister wasn't my sister at all. She was my mother. If this story shocks you already, just wait. What you're about to hear isn't fiction. It's twisted, it's emotional, and it's real. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more real-life stories that will leave you speechless. My name is Riley. I grew up thinking I had a pretty typical life: a mom, a dad, and a big sister named Sophie. Sophie was 14 years older than me, a little bossy, super smart, and way too overprotective. But I didn't question it. That was just Sophie. Our house was quiet, not sad, just muted. My mom always looked tired. She'd spend hours staring out the window or folding laundry like her hands were moving on autopilot. My dad? He was around, but emotionally, he was checked out. Sophie, though, she was loud, bright, full of plans and warnings. Don't talk to strangers. Don't stay out late. Don't wear that skirt, it's too short. I used to joke that she was like a third parent. Funny how jokes age terribly. One afternoon, I was cleaning out the attic looking for old photo albums for a school project. That's when I found the box. It was buried beneath a pile of winter coats and dusty holiday decorations. Inside, old photographs, torn letters, a baby blanket with R embroidered on the corner, and a Polaroid. In the photo, Sophie, 14 years old, was sitting on a hospital bed. She looked pale, sweaty, exhausted, and in her arms was a newborn baby. The handwriting at the bottom read, "Riley, June 2007. My blood turned cold. That was the month I was born. But Sophie, she wasn't old enough to be my mother. She was my sister, wasn't she? I stormed downstairs, heart pounding like a drum in my chest. "Mom?" I asked, waving the photo. She looked at it once, just once, and her face lost all color. Her hands trembled, but she didn't say a word. She just walked away. The silence after that photo was louder than any screaming could have been. I started noticing everything. Sophie's protectiveness, my mom's emotional distance, the way our aunts would accidentally say things like, "You're just like your mother," and then catch themselves and change it to, "I mean, your sister." I couldn't unsee it. I started digging. Old medical records, school documents, photos that didn't quite match the timeline. And I kept thinking, why didn't anyone tell me? Why the lie? Was I that shameful? An accident hidden in plain sight? Summer came. Sophie returned home from college. We were alone in the kitchen one evening when I finally asked, "Why did you lie to me?" She blinked. "About what?" I threw the photo onto the table. "About this. About you being my mom." She froze. Her hands went limp. She sat down slowly, like her legs couldn't hold her weight anymore. Her voice barely made a sound. "You were never supposed to find out like this." I stared at her, heart racing. "So it's true?" She nodded. Tears filled her eyes. "I was just a kid. I didn't know what to do. I didn't even know I was pregnant until the 5th month. Grandma, she said the only way to protect you, to protect me, was to pretend. Pretend I was your sister. And I did. I lived that lie every single day." I felt the world tilt sideways. Suddenly, every memory I had of Sophie, her warnings, her grounding me when I came home late, her wiping my nose when I was sick, it all made sense. She wasn't being a bossy big sister. She was being a mother, my mother. But that wasn't even the worst part, because what she told me next, about my father, about the night she got pregnant, that was where the real story began. "You were never supposed to find out like this," Sophie whispered again. We were sitting at the kitchen table. I was gripping the edges of my chair like they were the only things keeping me tethered to the ground. And Sophie, she looked like someone who had been running from something for too long. and finally got caught. I didn't know what to say. There were 100 questions, racing, screaming in my head, but I could only ask one. Who's my dad? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood up slowly, walked to the fridge, pulled out a bottle of water and took a long sip like she was trying to swallow down the memory itself. Then she turned to me. "I never told anyone this," she said. "Not even Mom." I blinked. "But I thought Grandma knew?" Sophie shook her head. "She knew about you, but not about him." "Then, who was he?" She exhaled, sat down again, and for the first time, I saw her age. Not physically, but emotionally. She looked like a woman who'd lived too many lives by 20. "His name was Jason," she said quietly. "He was 21. I was 14. My breath hitched. He didn't force me," she added quickly, like she was defending him. Or maybe herself. But I didn't really know what love was. And he did. He used that. I thought I was special. I thought I was mature enough to make my own decisions. Her voice cracked. But I wasn't. I didn't know what to say. Sophie wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. "When I found out I was pregnant, it was already too late for anything else. I was scared out of my mind. I was still a child. Grandma lost it. She didn't want anyone to find out. She said we'd move away, tell people she had another child, that I'd be your sister, not your mother." I whispered, "And you agreed?" Sophie looked at me with such rawness it almost hurt to see it. "I didn't want to, but I didn't want to lose you more. They said if we gave you up for adoption, they'd place you with strangers. What if something happened to you? What if they were cruel or cold? At least this way I could be near you, even if I had to lie to you, every single day." I suddenly remembered all the moments she had been there, bandaging my scraped knees, reading me bedtime stories, holding me when I had nightmares, picking me up from school, even when she had exams. Those weren't sisterly gestures. They were a mother's love, hidden in plain sight. Still, I was angry. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" My voice cracked as the tears came rushing forward. "I lived my whole life thinking you were just my bossy big sister. I told you everything. I trusted you." Sophie nodded silently, tears sliding down her cheeks. I know I hurt you. I wanted to tell you so many times, but I didn't want you to hate me." I stood up. I couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. Everything I thought I knew, my identity, my family, my memories, they all felt fake now. "I need to be alone," I muttered and rushed out the door. I walked for hours. My phone buzzed. Sophie. Grandma. Again and again. I didn't answer. I ended up at the park where she used to take me every Saturday, where I used to think she was the coolest sister ever for pushing me on the swings until sunset. Now, I didn't know who I was. Not Riley, not her daughter, not a sister, just a question mark. I sat on that swing, letting the chains creak and my thoughts spiral. It hurt. The lie. The years. But beneath all that pain was something even more confusing. Love. Because despite everything, I still loved her. I came home the next morning just after sunrise. The house felt hollow, like even the walls were holding their breath. My feet creaked across the wooden floor as I stepped inside. No one was in the kitchen, no one in the living room, but on the dining table sat a letter. It was addressed to me, not in Sophie's handwriting, Grandma's. I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to read it. I didn't want another truth. Not yet. But I picked it up, and as I unfolded the letter, I swear the air in the room shifted. My dear Riley, I always knew this day would come. I just prayed I wouldn't be alive to see it. The truth is, you were never a mistake. You were a miracle born from a terrible choice. Sophie didn't deserve what happened to her. And neither did you. I made the decision to raise you both this way because I was scared. Scared of what people would say. Scared of what would happen to Sophie. I thought I was protecting her. But maybe I was only protecting myself. The letter went on. Paragraphs of guilt, of love, of desperate justification. She fought me. She wanted to tell you the truth years ago, but I begged her not to. I told her it would ruin everything. And maybe it did, because in trying to save you both, I think I broke you. By the time I finished reading, my hands were shaking. I didn't realize Sophie had come downstairs. She stood silently in the doorway, her eyes swollen from crying. "You read it," she said softly. I nodded. We didn't speak for a while. We just looked at each other. No more lies, no more pretending. Just two people staring across the wreckage of a collapsed truth. Sophie motioned for me to follow her. We went up to the attic, the place where everything had started. She pulled open a chest I hadn't seen before. Inside, a stack of notebooks, old baby clothes, a bracelet engraved with my name, and a sonogram image, labeled Sophie, 2007. "I kept everything," she whispered, "even when they told me to forget." She handed me the sonogram, her fingers trembling. "This was the first time I saw you. You were the size of a plum, and I remember thinking, no matter what anyone said, I'd never let you go." Something broke inside me then, not in a bad way, more like a dam that had been holding back too much for too long. I dropped the photo and threw my arms around her. We cried. Together. For the years we lost, for the love we disguised, for the truth we finally allowed to breathe. Later that day, we sat down with Grandma. She was quiet, old, tired, but when she looked at us, I could see something in her eyes I hadn't noticed before. Shame, and something else. Relief. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have let Sophie be your mother, but I thought I knew better. And I didn't." We didn't say we forgave her. Not then. Some wounds take time. But we listened, and maybe that was a start. That week, things slowly shifted. Sophie stopped calling herself my sister. She didn't say the word mom yet, but she looked at me like I was hers, and I guess I always had been. Sophie started calling me Riley again, but this time every word that came from her mouth sounded different, full of intention, like she had finally been given permission to speak in her own voice, not someone else's script. She didn't ask me to call her Mom. Not yet. I didn't offer either. There was still too much space between the lie and the truth, and we were just beginning to cross it. We decided to start slowly. One night, we sat together and made a list, a literal pen and paper list, of things we both wanted to talk about but never could. The day I was born, your first time holding me, what it felt like lying to me on my birthdays, how we tell the rest of the family. That last one made us pause. Because the truth wasn't just ours anymore. I started with my best friend, Jada. I thought she'd freak out. Instead, she hugged me and said, "Girl, that actually makes so much sense. You and Sophie always had this weird mother-daughter vibe, and I never knew why." We both laughed. It felt good, like maybe this new version of reality didn't have to be full of shame and brokenness. Maybe it could be full of clarity, even healing. Not everyone reacted like Jada, though. When we told Aunt Claire, one of Grandma's sisters, she went stiff. Her jaw clenched. "Your grandmother swore us all to silence," she muttered, "said she'd disown anyone who dared speak the truth." I asked her why no one ever broke the silence. She looked away and whispered, "Because we were cowards." Despite the awkwardness, I appreciated the honesty. Secrets rot families from the inside. And now I could see the damage that rot had done. The strained smiles, the careful silences, the way no one ever told me I looked like my mom, because saying that would have meant admitting everything. About 2 weeks later, Sophie came to me holding an envelope. "This is Jason's last known address," she said. "He moved away years ago, but part of me wants to try." I didn't answer at first, but later that night I couldn't sleep. I kept wondering who he was, if he even remembered Sophie, if he knew he had a daughter, me. Did he care? We didn't decide right away, but we agreed on one thing. If we were going to rebuild the truth, we needed to do it completely. No more half-stories. No more hiding. So the next day, we got in the car and drove 2 hours to the return address Sophie still had on an old letter. The neighborhood was run down, a rusted mailbox with faded numbers, the front lawn overgrown. It looked abandoned. We knocked anyway. No answer. We knocked again. Still nothing. Sophie left a note, just in case. "This is Sophie. I don't want anything from you, but Riley deserves to know who you are, if you're willing." We drove home, mostly in silence. But it wasn't the awkward kind. It was peace. Like we'd opened a window and let all the dust out. That night, I walked into Sophie's room. She was journaling. I stood in the doorway and said, "I don't know if I'm ready to call you Mom yet." She smiled without looking up. "That's okay. I'll wait." And I believed her. We'd lost 17 years, but we still had time. Time to relearn each other. Time to forgive the silence. Time to call things by their real names. It came 3 days later, a plain white envelope, no return address, just my name. Riley, not to the house of, not resident, just me. Sophie wasn't home when I found it. My hands shook as I slid my finger beneath the seal. Inside, a single page, typed. "Riley, I don't know how to start this. I didn't even know you existed until I got Sophie's note. I won't pretend I'm not shocked, and I won't pretend I'm proud of who I was back then. If Sophie told you everything, then you know what I did was wrong. I was too old. She was too young. I convinced myself it was harmless, but it wasn't. I hurt her, and I walked away because I didn't want to face that." My stomach twisted. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not writing to beg for it. I just wanted to say, "I'm sorry. If you ever want to meet, you can write to this P.O. box. I'll be there, but only if you want that. Jason." I read it twice, then a third time. I didn't know how to feel. There was no anger in me. Not really. More like a strange emptiness. I had always wondered who he was, but now that I had the answer, I didn't feel closer to anything, only farther from the fantasy I used to build in my head. He wasn't some mystery man lost to time. He was a coward, but a human one. Sophie came home that night. I handed her the letter. She didn't speak as she read. When she finished, her hands dropped to her sides. "I wasn't sure he'd write back," she whispered. I nodded. "I don't know what to do with it." "You don't have to do anything," she said. "He doesn't get a say in who you become." The next morning, I went to Grandma's room. She was sitting by the window, with her tea, staring at the birds. "You okay?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "Better than I deserve." We sat in silence for a bit. Then I asked something I'd never dared to ask before. "Did you ever regret hiding the truth?" She was quiet for a long time. "Every day," she finally said. "But I was raised in a world where shame controlled everything. I thought silence was strength. Now I know it was fear." I leaned my head on her shoulder. For the first time in my life, I saw my family not as a structure, but as people, messy, flawed, trying, and I was part of that. Later that week, I wrote my own letter. I didn't send it to Jason. I wrote it for myself. I poured everything into it. My questions, my confusion, my pain, my unexpected gratitude. I ended it with, "I may never know what kind of person you are now, but I know what kind of person I want to be, and that's enough." Then I folded it, tucked it in a notebook, and let it rest. Healing doesn't come all at once. It comes in layers, letters, late-night talks, old photographs finally looked at without flinching. Sophie and I. We started over. We cooked together, laughed, watched movies where daughters fought with mothers, and grinned at each other knowingly. Sometimes she'd reach out and squeeze my hand during the emotional scenes. Not saying anything, but that squeeze told me everything. It happened quietly, no dramatic music, no build-up, just a Tuesday morning. I was heading out for school. Sophie handed me my lunch and gave me that anxious look moms always give. "Do you have your charger, your keys, your homework?" I rolled my eyes with a smile. Yes, all of it. And then, halfway out the door, I paused, turned back, and said it. "Thanks, Mom." The word slipped out naturally, like it had always been waiting. I don't know who was more surprised, me or her. She didn't say anything at first, but I saw her hand slowly cover her mouth and tears pool in her eyes like she was hearing it for the very first time. Because she was. From that day on, things felt different. Lighter. More real. We weren't pretending anymore. Of course, there are still hard days. I still have questions. Sometimes I wish we could redo it all and start fresh from the beginning. Me in her arms, her being proudly called Mom from the start. But we don't get to rewrite the past. We only get to decide how much truth we allow into our future. And ours? It's finally full of it. If you've made it this far, thank you. I know my story isn't ordinary, but if it made you think about your family, your truth, or the things left unsaid, then maybe it was worth sharing. Before you go, don't forget to like this video if it moved you, and please subscribe for more real stories that uncover the unexpected. Drop a comment if something like this ever happened in your life, or just to say you're here, listening.